Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Tabadlab Live. Tabadlab Live is our series of conversations with people who can help us understand the world, help us understand change. Uh, Today, we're lucky to be joined by Dr. Paul Staniland from the University of Chicago. Uh, Paul completed his PhD in insurgent groups and uh, how violence sort of develops between different groups within states, and also how it metastasizes into interstate conflict. One of the reasons why Dr. Paul Staniland is a well-known figure amongst people who are interested in South Asia is his work on Kashmir in particular. Given the recent state of the relationship between Pakistan and India, we thought it'd be fantastic to invite Dr. Paul Staniland to talk to us and help us understand his perspective on the relationship between India and Pakistan, and more widely, the interstate dynamics as they exist right now, particularly with the context of the China-India standoff. Welcome to the Tabadlab Live, Dr. Staniland. Thanks for making time for us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
We we often, in Pakistan, especially since Balakot, there's been a real concern that the world has kind of given up on South Asia, and from the Pakistani perspective, it's not an even giving up. It's given up on South Asia, having handed the mantle of regional hegemony to India for many reasons, including, I would say, existential ones. This notion, of course, for many reasons, and for many Pakistanis, not all, but for many, is bottom line unacceptable. And so the fuel for the conflict, notwithstanding the Kashmir sort of issue, notwithstanding many other disputes, both of an international nature and bilateral, is it fair for Pakistanis to assume that this disengagement globally from South Asia, that at least for many Pakistanis, is in favor of India? Is that a fair assumption for Pakistanis to make, or are we just being too sensitive?
I mean, I think it is definitely the case that in the last 15 years in particular, maybe last 20 years, the United States has tilted toward India. European countries have, engaged substantially with India. For instance, France has become, deeply involved, or tried to become deeply involved. And India has been able to reach out successfully to countries like Saudi Arabia that, traditionally had maybe been seen more as kind of, on Pakistan's side. So I think there's certainly been a shift in the overall international balance. On the other hand, the rise of China, I think, complicates that a lot, right? And so China is much more active in the region than it has been in most times in the past. And it creates kind of some degree of a counterweight. The question, I think, for Pakistan, as well as for China, the US, and others, is how to navigate that kind of very complex web of relations. So I think in general, there has been a tilt to India, but it's not a universal tilt, let's put it that way. It's more nuanced and complicated.
Sure, it always is, and trying to understand those complications is why we look to benefit from folks like yourself. Maybe the greatest manifestation of this tilt that you're talking about was the end of February last year, because within a matter of, I want to say, not more than 72 hours, I think the US, France, the UK, Germany, and not strangely, and I think quite a lot more significantly than at least Pakistanis like to admit, Australia. These 5 countries in particular put out official statements that, at least for me, were nothing short of essentially an endorsement of the Indian action across international boundaries, what we've now come to call the Balakot incident or attack or strike or whatever you want to call it. But that was the first time that something like that had happened in 50 years. And the fact that it was treated so nonchalantly by these 4 big powers, and I think one significant regional power that I think, again, to its chagrin, to its to its own detriment, Pakistan tends to not think about as seriously as perhaps it should. What does that mean going forward? And particular, there's a lot of fear right now, and the Prime Minister, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, has repeatedly pointed to the potential for a new flare-up based on what he's calling potentially a false flag operation. What happens the morning after, or the hours after a false flag or a real flag, whatever you want to call it? But the next incident, would India not feel dramatically more empowered than it ever did before, thanks to the tilt of these five big powers?
So I think there's certainly, the day after, I think nobody really knows what happens. So on the one hand, there was a lot of support for India after the Balakot strike. I think you're right. I understand, and I've spoken with many Pakistanis who really bridle at this assessment, but many in the West basically see cross-border terrorism, armed groups emanating from Pakistan as having been a huge source of kind of international instability. And so India's gotten much more kind of slack because of that perception. I don't, we can talk about that, but I think it's just a fact that that's how many Western countries see it. So there's slack. On the other hand, I think there remains real concern about escalation by countries like the United States. So there was, in fact, US, I don't know any details, but some kind of back channel involvement in de-escalation. So I don't think anybody's looking for a flare-up that kind of turns into a regional war or a major kind of tit-for-tat series of strikes. And I think, the Pakistani response in some ways was quite effective in actually kind of signaling that, like, this is not a pushover kind of situation. And I think has induced, or may have induced, a greater degree of caution, right? I mean, the difference between, I may be getting my dates wrong, but kind of the Indian coverage on February 26th and February 27th was striking, right? So I don't think there's kind of a blank check for like the Indians to do whatever they want. There's still real concern about escalation and concern about just how things get out of control. So I wouldn't read it as kind of an open, full-throated endorsement, but it is the case that I think that was, as you note, a very telling signal that the world, or parts of the world, were kind of basically looked sympathetically to India's case. Now, if that had turned into something more, right, a series of airstrikes, ballistic or, missiles being used, then that is a different kettle of fish. I think this was seen, at least in intent, as relatively limited, right? And it's also not clear what happened, to put it mildly. So things could have gone in a whole lot of different directions that maybe might not have received that kind of international support.
One of the arguments that I don't know if I've done it publicly as much as I certainly have privately, but since we're having the conversation, one of the reasons that I think the U.S. In particular has had this tilt, well, two of the reasons. The origin, of course, is the Kargil fiasco, and afterwards, it's the way the story evolved in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. The fact that so much of the failure of ISAF, NATO, and the U.S. in Afghanistan was so easily pinned on Pakistan, I think led itself for a lot of these Western powers to see the world the way that India had in many ways been asking them to see the world for a long time. And that confirmation bias, I think Afghanistan was the perfect arena for that to happen. Now that the U.S. is I think if you look at the U.S. position on Afghanistan today, it's essentially exactly what General Pervez Musharraf had been saying, essentially since about mid-2002 onwards. But that's not going to change the tilt vis-a-vis India. How do you think this will play out if Afghanistan does become fundamentally different in terms of sustained peace? Do you think that'll have any impact on Western powers being able to see the argument from the Pakistan standpoint? Or do you think the burden of the LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and the Haqqani network is now so heavy that there's no reversal of this kind of strategic, for Pakistanis, clearly disequilibrium that the West has adopted?
So, I think there's it's impossible to predict the future. I've been wrong many times. I don't think you're ever going to see a full tilt, reversal, I should say, of the tilt back to the 1980s or the 60s or something, or parts of the 60s, right? I think the question is what does it look like? And what position does Pakistan have within a balance that overall may still favor India, but that could to very, very different degrees. I do think at least, in Western countries, the kind of Lashkar, Jaish, Haqqani network image associated with Pakistan remains very vivid. And public opinion polling in the US shows a not particularly positive view of Pakistan, just as public opinion polling in Pakistan shows an extremely negative view of the US. I think a peaceful Afghanistan would probably change some of this, right? It would, the combination of perceived success around the Financial Action Task Force and kind of its, the measures it's asked for, a peaceful Afghanistan, maybe it gives Pakistan breathing space. Certainly the Trump administration, depending which day it is or which hour it is, has shown more volatility than, maybe a more conventional administration would. I think honestly, from the Pakistani perspective, and as an American thinking about what a Pakistani perspective might be, a Pakistan that's growing economically, that seems politically stable, that is not seen as a launching point for transnational terrorist and militant groups, is a big country, over 200 million people, not a country to be ignored, right? So a lot also depends on kind of how Pakistan is able to evolve in the coming years. And obviously coronavirus hits at the worst possible time as you think about the economy. But I think there's some degree of slack, there's some degree of agency, depending on kind of how Pakistan changes, how the region changes, what happens with Afghanistan, and also how the American administration in particular views the rise of China, and kind of whether to compete with it, to try to complement it, how to think about things like Belt and Road and CPEC, are all pretty open questions that could shift kind of Pakistan's relationship with the US within this broader strategic context in which India is just much bigger, right? And you can't get around that. So it's always going to be seen economically and militarily as kind of a more significant player on America's global chessboard.
Right. And I mean, India is bigger, but, I think two things that seem like they're not going to be easy to change, and that will continue to keep Pakistan locked in essentially geopolitically where it's been since the beginning. The first is, of course, Kashmir. That is an unresolved issue, and I think it's been exacerbated dramatically by the actions of the Indian state on August 5th. But the other is something that's relatively newer, although that story really begins in the late 80s with the sort of the long, there's a lot of talk about Ertugrul, this Turkish TV series that is sweeping up a lot of sentiment globally, and particularly here in Pakistan, creating quite a stir. But, the original Ertugrul in this region was, of course, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata epics that were telecast on Doordarshan that I think switched on, a certain middle-class Hindu consciousness about that identity and its salience in the modern world. And of course, then we see, of course, the BJP go from 3 or 4 seats in the 88 election to taking power in the mid 90s. You see Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Lal Krishna Advani as the kind of the doyens or the godfathers of that political movement. And for whatever that was worth, the changes that started taking place in India, they obviously led to massive economic growth. And then you suddenly have this Narendra Modi phenomenon, which I think even up to 2013, late 2013, I don't think anybody thought that Narendra Modi, known as the Butcher of Gujarat, not by Pakistanis alone, but, named in that way by Western organizations, banned from traveling to the West, really looked down upon globally, now become a major global figure on the back of, that massive growth that probably came about because of Hindutva, version 1.0. And some of the changes, obviously, that preceded that under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh when he was actually finance minister. So that whole historical sort of background, I go into it because it seems increasingly difficult that Pakistan is just going to sign over Indian ownership of Kashmir. It seems even more difficult that a robustly assertive and aggressive Hindu nationalist is kind of the term you guys use, but it's actually a Hindu extremist state now. For at least, for anyone that's watching, the language and the posture domestically of the BJP and the RSS, you put those two things together. I just don't see any chance that Pakistan is going to be able to step back and say, we'll just focus on economic growth and India can do whatever it wants, not just in Kashmir, but in terms of the global stage, because the Western nations have given up. I guess what I'm saying is I don't see any chance of Pakistan giving up on.
No, I mean, to be clear, whether I like it or not, right? In my world, everybody's demilitarized and gets along great. In an ideal world, obviously, I would expect the Pakistani state to continue to prioritize defense and security. What I would say is, from the Western perspective, the way in which that is done is enormously important, because Pakistan has been seen, and we don't need to argue about kind of the accuracy of that, but it is a fact it's been seen as a source of instability for other countries, including Western countries. Whereas, and I don't say this as justification, but just to be kind of blunt about it, whatever happens with Hindu nationalism in India is not a huge concern for most people in Washington, D.C. It may be seen as unsavory, unpleasant, but it's not like generating, recruits for transnational terror networks that are blowing things up in Western cities, right? And so that is a context that I think, whether Pakistanis like it or not, is something that needs to be kept in mind. I mean, you've seen it, the Western media is very critical of Modi. Human rights organizations, very critical. The State Department just put out its religious, its reports on kind of religious freedom yesterday, I believe. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom has been very critical of Modi. Also very critical of Pakistan very often. But it's not clear what that turns into strategically. And that, I think, is an area where Pakistan does have some room to maneuver. How it pursues its security, how it balances development, security, these issues are there's space, right? There's agency for Pakistani leaders, even if they are stuck in a structural context that they're not happy with. So I think that is one thing to keep in mind. Now, with the rise of India, I think it creates interesting challenges for countries that want to do business with India. Because on the one hand, it's a big country, 1.35 billion, right? Big market, interested in at least being involved in some kind of, maybe not balancing China, but preventing China from getting too strong. On the other hand, there are recurrent concerns, both about human rights issues, right, related to what you're talking about, economic reforms, are they what are needed in the eyes of outside countries, and then issues of defense preparedness. So I think, there are challenges to Western ideals for what they might want India to be that the present government present, that are maybe not overwhelming, but not trivial at all.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You talked about Pakistani agency, and I immediately, being the Pakistani that I am, I think of Indian agency.
Sure.
And particularly, I think of the space India has, and kind of a working thesis, and I haven't really developed it much more thoroughly or thoroughly at all. But I'm working on it. But one of the ways in which I'm looking at the China-India standoff is a little bit different from the way that I think a lot of people seem to want to look at it. People like big game theory. They like, contest, and they like historical trends and repetition. But the way in which the Indian state has behaved, in particular, let's say over the last month or so with respect to China, signals, I think, the potential for something very different from the way it's being interpreted. There's a lot of emphasis on, India taking on China at the behest of the US. I just don't see the Indian state as ever having played that game. That's a game that certainly Pakistan has played, and many other countries have played. But I don't see India having played that game before or being willing to play it now. And I also see potentially Western powers being quite capable of knowing that. There might not be Alice Wells might seem to be, an Indian diplomat at times to me, uh, maybe not to folks in the U.S. But I don't think that the U.S. system is blind to the very different way in which India is dealing with a conflict with China than the way India deals with a conflict with any other neighbor. So with Nepal, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, and with Pakistan, of course, mostly with Pakistan, but with all of its other neighbors, very aggressive, very interested in demonstrating that it's the big man on campus in this South Asian university here. But with China, very willing to kind of be pretty zen about what's going
Yeah.
on. How are you interpreting this kind of
No,
very calm reaction to what China's essentially been doing in terms of territory?
yeah, I think there's a huge difference in how India is dealing with China compared to how it deals with Pakistan or Sri Lanka, as you said, among others. I think there are a couple of things going on. One is that China is big and powerful and has a lot of military capability and a lot of economic clout. And I don't think the Indians are looking to get into kind of a sustained arms race. I think they know that this is not a country they want to kind of unnecessarily mix it up with. They want to try to kind of stand firm where they can. So that's one thing, the balance of power here. And I hate to sound kind of like a cynical, cold-eyed realist, but it has something to tell us here. The other thing that's really different is China is not hardwired into Indian domestic politics the way Pakistan is in particular. Um, I mean, Hindu-Muslim cleavages, the legacies of partition, Hindu nationalism. The Congress party has its own relationship with Pakistan that's not, particularly pleasant. Those things really matter, and they play into Indian domestic politics, right? And so, you can see in the election campaign in 2019, Modi, Shah, these guys were really pushing, Balakot, and they were kind of forgetting about some of the other more complicated aspects of all of that. With China, it doesn't have that kind of resonance, at least yet. There's increasing negative Indian public opinion toward China, but it doesn't have the same kind of visceral resonance. So I think that reduces the pressures on the Indian government to like really look like tough guys. And so you've noticed they've reined in a lot of their more hardline, TV anchor people, the kind of folks who would, go off on Pakistan for days at a time. There were 1 or 2 days when they were basically saying Beijing has bowed to us, and then quickly that all stopped. So I think there's also this sense that China is a big, powerful country. India doesn't want to get into it with China unless it needs to. And it doesn't have the same domestic escalation pressures that Pakistan, presents for Indian political leaders. So I think it's a very different response. Absolutely.
I think that also then complicates some of the, and again, it's a very Pakistani perspective, but we see a lot of neoconish sort of cheerleading from friends of India, if you will, in the U.S., who point to India's vital strategic importance as a counterweight to China. This has been a tough few weeks for that crowd, because it clearly India is not the kind of friend to the U.S. strategic game or U.S. strategic interests that certainly Pakistan has repeatedly served as in the past. I think the question there really is, if India is willing to acquiesce to some extent strategically to or with China, then where does that leave the big strategic gamble that I think a lot of US strategists made essentially around the same time as Kargil? Now, I don't want to say it was because of Kargil, although I have said that in the past. It certainly, I think, helped inform that shift in perspective in DC. But what happens to how DC looks at India as a partner in the South Asia region?
So I should say I'm like the least important person in America. So I don't really know how DC's, like I'm not text messaging with, the Trump NSC about it. So I don't want to claim to like have knowledge that I don't. Let me give you a couple ways of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I just don't want to, tell you how DC is thinking. So first, I think the Indians, you're right, are not interested in being the Japan to the United States, right? Maybe more like the France. I think the Pakistanis can explain for a variety of reasons why hopping too closely in bed with the Americans can be a bad idea, or at least, Pakistani elites getting in bed with the Americans for, joint strategic reasons can end poorly for lots of different parties. I think the Indians don't want to get too enmeshed with that. So the soft version from DC would be, look, we don't expect the Indians to get into big fights with the Chinese. We don't expect them to kind of go toe-to-toe militarily. As long as they're providing kind of an alternative model and they're kind of just acting as a buffer on Chinese influence in South Asia, that's good enough. So for an example of that, Bob Blackwell and Ashley Tellis have a foreign affairs article from sometime last year, 2019, called something like, India is America's best bet in Asia, right? And it's basically saying, we don't need India to go, toe to toe with the Chinese, just let it do its thing, right? There's a harder version though, which is more in line with what you're articulating, which is like, hold on, in India that is still engaged in strategic autonomy, that's still enmeshed in these trade disputes with the Americans, that, is taking some domestic turns that are not really necessarily great or are actively in fact bad. How should we think about this country, right? And that, I think, is when you get into more ambiguity. And depending what your expectations are, you could end up in a world where a lot of people in the US have expected more of India than India has developed. And a lot of people in New Delhi look at those Americans and say, well, what did you expect from us, right? So there is potential there for a mismatch. And there have been articles. Samir Lalwani at the Stimson Center wrote a piece with a co-author whose name I'm forgetting, talking about India fatigue in Washington and how the India relationship hasn't lived up to expectations. So I would say there's kind of a spectrum from India's doing just fine, let it do its thing, to we expected too much of India, they've let us down, and we need to do something else. So it's not always clear what that alternative is.
How much of that fatigue do you think is owed to the performative aspects of right-wing religious politics? Right, like I look at somebody like Jay Shankar, who, if you follow the region at all over the last couple of decades, is like this kind of global superstar diplomat figure, somebody who you assume would have reasonably progressive personal views, would feel reasonably uncomfortable with Narendra Modi and the agenda, who's now become kind of the poster child for this kind of latter-day Indian / RSS nationalism, which is, frankly, for a lot of, I mean, look, the perspective I come from here is, I'm amongst, a demographic in Pakistan that's always pointed to India and say, look at how well they're doing. Why can't we be more like them? Why can't our democracy be more like them? Why can't our economy be more like them? Why can't our universities focus on math and physics and science like them? And now we have, the India that we have, and a lot of us are like, whoa, right? Like,
right.
A little bit embarrassed about what we've been talking about. So this India fatigue, just talk a little bit more about how that's evolved.
I think they're different sources. They come from different places. There are companies and people in the Defense Department who want the Indians to buy lots of guns from the Americans. So there's a market defense, part of it. There's a kind of more purely business part of it, which is, look, we expected, Modi to be the Lee Kuan Yew of India, right? This is back from like 2013, 2014, modernizing, not all this Hindutva stuff. That's just for show. He's really going to kind of govern, right? There's some disappointment there. And then I think parts of the American left look at this domestic setup, right? So if you were following some of after 370, Congresswoman Jayapal introduced a resolution of the US House that was kind of about human rights abuses in Kashmir. And it got, more support than I expected, right? Mostly from Democrats, mostly from progressive Democrats who look at Modi as part of kind of this wave of right-wing illiberal democracy, I think is the best word for it. They would slot him in with Bolsonaro in Brazil, maybe Orban in Hungary, and are just very uncomfortable with it, right? And would need to really be sold that there's this great strategic or economic value for India that should make US policymakers and citizens kind of swallow hard and accept what's going on domestically in India. So I think there are different sources of potential India fatigue. I honestly don't know if India fatigue is like a real thing that has afflicted DC. But I think there are parts of the American political system that are much more skeptical of India than others. I think that's the fairest way to put it. How that plays out in terms of policy is hard to know right now. We've got an election coming up. Donald Trump is president. So it's impossible to know what policy will be tomorrow, much less 5 years from now. But there are some of these pressure points in the American political system as it looks at India right now, for sure. And I think 2019 was a I don't want to say break point, but it was an inflection point where I think a lot of people who, looking at the aftermath of Balakot, so you can say whatever you feel about the Balakot strike itself, but there was a lot of chest thumping afterwards that I think looked odd. And then there was the election campaign, so Amit Shah kind of unleashed. Then there was 370, then the Citizenship Amendment Act, right? And then Citizenship Amendment Bill, the JNU attacks, the riots in Delhi. And I think there was this period where there was, and maybe it will last, right? Where a lot of people looked at India and said, boy, I thought we were getting something different, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to know now in this new coronavirus world whether that will stick or not. But I think there was a moment where Indian diplomacy ran into this domestically induced set of bumps that occupied a lot of attention, right? And a lot of time and effort at minimum as a cost.
So we've talked a little bit about India, and of course, as a Pakistani, again, I love talking about India, especially now because the India that a lot of us have been talking about for many years is more manifest, and to the point about 2019, with kind of the curtain being drawn on sort of the India that's been obvious and visible to Pakistanis for many years. Although I can't claim that myself, I'm part of the crowd that, as I said earlier, gets pointed at and told, haha, we told you so. And I think that's relevant because, in a sense, the more that India asserts its version, the 2019 version of India, and I don't think it's going anywhere if you look at Modi's approval numbers, whether it's post-demonetization or post-COVID. I mean, these are mid-80s favorable numbers. He's completely made of Teflon. What that does to politics here in Pakistan is something that I think people don't talk about enough. And if you look at some of the ways in which the Pakistani state has acquiesced with demands that have been made of Pakistan for a long time, vis-a-vis UNSC 1267 organizations, and there's a whole list, and we can talk a lot about FATF. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons I think for the global positivity that General Bajwa is welcomed with, notwithstanding people's reading of domestic politics in Pakistan and maybe the army's growing influence in areas where maybe it shouldn't have that kind of influence. But the reason that that's kind of put aside, I think, is actually how Balakot was handled by General Bajwa and the military, and more generally, how General Bajwa has responded to questions and requests and demands that have been made for a long time, including in Afghanistan. But putting aside Afghanistan, I guess my worry is that the more that India stays the way it is right now, the harder it'll be for Pakistan to be the kind of Pakistan that I think General Bajwa has tried to push it in the direction of. And what that means is that ultimately the original instigators for the existence and the emergence of groups like LET and Jaish, that original source is not going anywhere. In fact, after August 5th, there can be arguments that it's come back in a big way. Not since the early 90s has the fillip for that kind of activity organically been there in the way that it is right now. How would you respond to that?
So, I mean, it's a loaded, in some ways it's a loaded question, right? Because for someone like me, who's an American liberal, like, the Bajwa doctrine, there's some things you could like, but there are others where I'm like, really, fifth generation warfare, like media censorship, this is not my cup of tea, just like Modi's India and Donald Trump's America are not my cup of tea, which means I'm basically an irrelevant person everywhere. But leaving that aside, okay, so I think your question is basically this. A hardline hawkish India creates powerful pressures for a hardline hawkish policy in Pakistan, right? That's how I interpret it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think it makes it much more difficult to extend olive branches, right? Now, the Indians say, look, we extended olive branches, the Pakistanis swatted them away. So you can go back and forth with the Indians about this till the cows come home, right? I don't say that as like a Hindu cow thing, just an Americanism. You can talk about that, endlessly. I think it's true, right? It's going to be much harder for Pakistan to accept India's fait accompli, or its effort at creating a fait accompli in Kashmir. That's how I read August 5th, an effort to say, this is over, it's done. The only thing to talk about is when we get, the the Pakistani side back on under Indian control, right? That's the Indian effort. I think that, and I've written on this a couple pieces, I think India, the central government, I can't tell if they sincerely did it or this is all just cynical. I think they radically, at least publicly, have overestimated how easy the task they have ahead of them is. Just even Indian administered Kashmir itself, much less everything else. I think the violence we've seen in recent months suggests that things are not well in the Kashmir Valley. I think all this stuff about development and governance, has very much yet to be seen. There still seems to be substantial local recruitment for, the various militant groups in the valley. So I don't see some level of kind of instability, violence, conflict in the Kashmir Valley going away anytime soon. I think it'll wax and wane like it has over the last 30 years now. So in that sense, I don't think this Indian fait accompli is necessarily going to work, right? I can't be confident of anything with 100% certainty, but I think that's going to make it very difficult. I don't see an India-Pakistan rapprochement anytime soon, right? I don't think the Modi government's interested. I don't think, given what you're talking about, the domestic pressures on any Pakistani prime minister or chief of army staff are going to be very strong to not concede anything, right? To not accept being imposed upon. So I don't see this ending well anytime soon. And I think, kind of hawkish pressures on both sides will continue into the future. I don't have like a hopeful story of, how Modi turns into Nixon going to China or anything like that, at least in the near term.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned China because if I have any hope in the bilateral dynamic, it is actually that hope rests in Beijing. I think we can be assured that Kabul will continue to be a place of contest rather than agreement or coming together. And I think as the Americans go away, there'll be even more incentive for India to do what it's been doing, and it hasn't been benign in Kabul. And for Pakistan, and certainly Pakistan has also not been a neutral observer in Afghanistan by any stretch. But whether it's Afghanistan or it's the pure play bilateral, contest between India and Pakistan over Kashmir or in other arenas, the one factor I think that is potentially going to, I don't think China does anything by imposition, at least not in the way that Americans would relate to. But is it too rosy to a lens to paint Beijing with, to say that if there is a hope for any kind of stability and not necessarily resolution, but at least a resting or a putting down of the guns, it will be because of the actions, investments, and direction that China takes vis-a-vis India and Pakistan?
I'll be honest, I'm not super optimistic about that. I mean, one could paint a scenario in which that works out. I think there's enough skepticism in India toward China that it's going to be very difficult for it to accept China as kind of a neutral broker, right? And India is big enough and has enough outside support that it's going to be hard for the Chinese to engage in like vigorous coercion to force the Indians to kind of settle, right? You could imagine the Chinese playing some kind of balancing role. So if I'm a Pakistani strategist, obviously China is an incredibly important, source of potential balance to keep the Indians at bay, if I'm thinking of it as a Pakistani strategist, right? So in that sense, you could have a balance that is maintained well enough that you don't have open conflict, right? In part because of the Pakistanis. Now, I think one thing that I'll be interested to see is how the American future administrations deal with China in South Asia. Because initially, and this is not something I study, but the Americans and the Obama administration were at least open to some extent to Belt and Road, or at least not as vigorously opposed as what the Trump administration has ended up being opposed to. I mean, if I'm remembering, the American administration officials really came out strongly against CPEC in the last year, like very vigorously, and I'm not sure that's going to work.
That was the source of my Alice Wells comment.
I mean, Alice Wells is not a popular person in a variety of places, including, yes, I thought that was at least one of the sources, right? Not a South, anyways, whatever. But I could imagine an American approach that is less directly confrontational with China, that says, look, the Chinese are going to do some of this stuff, but if you want, this is the American pitch, would be quality, integrity, we're not going to rip you off, international standards, maybe not in big infrastructure, but in other things. I think you could imagine a China role in South Asia that is, helps Pakistan get enough electricity to avoid rolling blackouts, for instance, improves transportation infrastructure, telecommunications, things like that. That could be good for everybody, right? And if the Americans are a complement, then that's good for everybody. So you could imagine that world, right? And I think that, at least my crude understanding of CPEC, is that that is at least one hope that Pakistani security managers and economic managers have had, right? CPEC as a spur to economic growth and development that helps Pakistan kind of get out of some of the holes it's found itself in. But I don't see China as the manager of the region.
Yeah.
Right? I think the Indians are not going to accept that. I also think that their domestic politics in other South Asian countries, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, that Bangladesh potentially, where if the Chinese push too hard or in the wrong ways, you get domestic backlash. You've seen that in Myanmar. You've seen it to some extent in Sri Lanka. So I think the Chinese are not, they make mistakes, they overreach, they get, just like the Americans, right? They get clumsy. So, I'm not like a hardcore China hawk Cold War 2.0 person, but I don't have as rosy an assessment of the Chinese, potential role moving forward.
Sure. I mean, one instrument of engagement potentially is the SCO, and I think the ability of the Chinese to get the Russians to work with them. We've certainly seen in the case of Afghanistan that there is increasing tendency towards kind of coming together with the Russians, given the traditional footprint that Moscow has in India and in New Delhi. It's nowhere near as influential as it used to be, and I think part of that corrosion might be Russia's growing relationship with Pakistan. But I don't think the Russia-Pakistan relationship is of a nature that it would displace India's importance to the Russians. Do you think there's any chance that I agree. I don't think. I also don't think China is very interested in playing arbiter. Certainly not in a formal, open role. Whatever China does between India and Pakistan is going to be relatively invisible. We'll hear about it or read about it in a couple of op-eds, that come out of China, and then we'll learn more about it when Sohasini or Mariana Babar here in Pakistan start writing about it. But really, where I think the venue for where this might all go down is actually the SCO. And I actually think that the membership for both these countries being offered simultaneously had a lot to do with this, with the BRI and the way in which Russia sees China's potential stabilizing role in this region.
And, there have been at least whispers about Chinese influence in Afghanistan as well. As, China, I view Chinese internal security policy with, as I said, a high degree of abhorrence, but they view themselves as facing like an Islamist transnational threat. That's a lot of what's going on with their, what I view as profoundly repressive policies. But they also would want a stable Afghanistan, right? So I think there's been at least some murmurs of a Chinese role, Chinese efforts to kind of keep things from totally falling apart. And I think, the US really just wants to get out of Afghanistan at this point. It's not like Vietnam, where it's this incredibly visceral, salient issue in American domestic politics. It's off the front pages, nobody cares that much, but the US wants out. And if the Chinese do something to help, great. I don't think that's an area of like grand, great power competition. So that's what I mean. There are these areas where the US and China could potentially, be complements, or the Chinese could serve a stability, enhancing role. So I don't want to say that's not possible. I'm just not sure at the grand strategic level. I don't think they would serve that role kind of at a grand strategic level in South Asia.
Well, listen, I tried for us to build towards some degree of optimism. I'll maintain that I think, the role Beijing might play is potentially much more positive than I think for, what would be possible for Americans to conceive, given legitimate, contest issues, and you mentioned earlier some of the values issues that get in the way when it comes to China.
Honestly, I would love a stabilizing Chinese role, and it's interesting. I think you look at China 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the U.S. debate was radically different about China. I think it's overreacted toward kind of Cold War 2.0 confrontation, but you could imagine alternative pasts, and maybe you could still imagine alternative futures in which China does play a more stabilizing role. I think right now, it's hard for me to imagine that, but I don't rule anything out. So I don't want to say we should just be pessimists. That's just kind of my read on the probabilities we're looking at here.
All my professor friends, kind of encourage me to be more realistic and stop seeking silver linings in every cloud. And so this conversation is no different. Dr. Staniland, this has been a real pleasure. I think the flow of the conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope people watching did too. Any final thoughts that you wanted to share before we sign out?
Well, I guess, you pushed me as a pessimist here. And so let me say you could imagine, not in the next year or two, but in the next 5 to 10 years, countries that stabilize after coronavirus, that can get some kind of sustainable economic growth going, right? There are ways to imagine a South Asia that is not as locked in conflict as it is now. I think that's become more difficult in the last couple of years to imagine, but I think it's not impossible. So I don't want to end this note on like, well, everything that was will just remain. But I think right now is not a great high point in kind of conflict in South Asia. So kind of balancing that, like where I think we are now, but also there are possibilities for kind of more stable and cooperative region is something I try to keep in my brain, um, as we move forward.
I really appreciate that note of optimism. I think, frankly speaking, I think I share your realistic assessment. This is an incredibly difficult time. I think for the modern nation state. I think so many things have changed about the way we talk to each other and the way in which we process information and present it to to people. And really conversations like this and what the Bod Lab is trying to do is to recover some space for genuine, sincere engagement across different viewpoints, different ideologies, different national interests, different strategic goals, but still a coming together rather than a tearing apart. So, and I think professors and teachers and academics and researchers need to be and will be at the forefront of that bringing together of people, places, and ideas. So I thank you for your time and helping us do that today, Dr. Staniland.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.